Hello, I'm Jeff Webster. I'm the curator here at the Grundy Museum, and today we are pleased to introduce John Whitenight's Hair Today, Hair Tomorrow, a look at the history of hair art. John Whitenight is an author, artist, educator, and collector. He's also been the consultant for our renovations and restorations over the past 2 years. We know that you're going to enjoy John's presentation, and I hope that you like and subscribe our channel. We'll see you later.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank the Grundy Museum for inviting me here to talk about two of my favorite subjects. The first one being hair work, and the second one being mourning. What we are going to do is take a trip through the 18th and 19th centuries, and we're going to talk about how people expressed their grief. And one of the ways they did was they used hair. In today's world, we don't think of hair that way at all. Hair today is a multi-billion-dollar business. You have all types of hair products, hair colors. People are getting expensive haircuts. People are trying to grow hair where there is no hair. People are trying to remove hair where they don't want hair. But during these times of these centuries that we're going to be talking about, hair had a whole different significance. Also, the whole idea of death was very, very different than the way we perceive it now. If you look back, truly, death was a part of life. And it has been noted that during the 1800s, the 1700s and the 1800s, right up through 1900, the average lifespan in Western civilization was about 35 to 45 years of age. And of course, that all changed with the 20th century, with all the medical advancements, the technology, and now that average has basically doubled. But back to the 18th and 19th centuries, they used hair as an object of sentimentality, of love, and remembrance. One of the key phrases here is memento mori. The phrase memento mori refers to, the literal translation is remembering death, or in this case, remembering the dead. Many times in French pieces, you will see the word souvenir, which translates to remember. So death was taken just as seriously as life during these centuries. And what we're going to do with this presentation is we're going to start with the 18th century for some rather early pieces of jewelry. And then eventually we will work our way up through the 19th century. In the 18th century, the hair work was predominantly from the Georgian periods in England. Now, not to say that we didn't have it going on here in the States, because we did. In cities like New York, in Philadelphia, one of the popular things to do was to paint miniatures. And these miniatures would be painted by famous artists, such as maybe one of the Peels, let's say Raphael Peale. Raphael Peale would paint your miniature on ivory. It would then be sent to the jeweler. The jeweler would do the gold casing, and along with that, the loved one or the loved ones of the deceased, they would send a lock of hair. And that lock of hair would be put in back of the miniature. And again, this could be as a brooch many times. But back on the idea of hair, it was, it is one of the most organic things. It grows out of all of us. It does not degrade when bodies are exhumed and whatnot. Oftentimes there is still the remains of the hair in the coffin. So if you want something, a memory, to be everlasting, you would obviously pick a material that is everlasting, and that is hair. Where did it really get its origins? We can go back to primitive cultures. How about taking hair as a scalp? It was a trophy. Also, you can talk about Northern Europe. And Northern Europe, we think, is the birthplace of a lot of this hair work. There still is a town in Sweden, and its name is Vamhus. It's in central Sweden, and it is the hair working center of Europe. They are still doing hair work. But I think it's time to get on to the jewelry. What we want to talk about now is we want to talk about the symbolism that was used during this period. So the symbolism of death and mourning, you would have a weeping willow. You would have a weeping person. You would have a broken urn. You could have an upside down torch. You could also have, for children, they also used a lamb, which was very, very common for children's memorials. You could have a skull. You could have a skeleton, particularly in the early pieces. Early 18th century, 17th century pieces, it was not uncommon to have a skull on top of the hair. But what we're going to talk about now is the jewelry, and this is all from the Georgian period. Now, with the jewelry, there are two facets to the hair work. There is that which was created at home, and we will be addressing that a little later, but there is the jewelry which was commercially made. So again, it was a very big cottage industry to do memorial jewelry. And again, that goes back, way back to the 18th century. So I want to start with the earliest piece we have today. This is what is referred to as a Stuart crystal. These were very popular during the Stuart reign or Stuart monarchy in England. So it really was part of the 17th century, which went into the 18th century, early 18th century. Now, interestingly enough, it is called a Stuart crystal because the top is not glass. It is actually carved, polished rock crystal. So that's how you can tell it's a very early piece. In this one, it has a magnificent, tiny, tiny bit of hair work in the center, a decoration, with some filigree around it. Then you have this great bezel. It's set in this bezel. Originally, this piece has been converted to a brooch. So that is not the original use of it. Generally, what would have been on this piece would be a bar that would go across, or a loop, and it would be used as a slide. And what the person would do, probably a lady, she would have her black ribbon around her neck, and then she would slide this up. It could also be worn on black ribbon on your wrist. So remember, black was the going color. This dates to 1740, this piece. Now we go into a more, let's say, a little fancier period. We're now going up into the 1780s, 1790. These pieces, to the best of our knowledge, are all English pieces. This very, very, very small, delicate ring has a wonderful, and we'll show you in the close-up, has a wonderful scene, cemetery scene. By the way, another symbol would have been the tomb itself or the gravestone. And here you see an urn, and next to it is the weeping willow tree, done in the most minute hair technique. And this technique, and we're going to talk about techniques more in detail as we move on, because there are about 4 techniques that we're going to discuss. This technique is called macerated hair. And what they would do is they would take the hair of the deceased, they would put it in a mortar and pestle, and they would grind the hair and make it into a powder. They would then take that, almost like a dry pigment, and they would take a varnish, perhaps, or a gum arabic, and with a tiny, 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 tiny brush, and mix the hair with the gum arabic, and they would actually paint it on the ivory. So this is a nice early example of macerated hair painting. They also used to do, and we'll look at these others, they also used to combine sepia-colored paint. So everything is just kind of brown like the hair. It's very subtle. This one has this minute engraving on it. It's just incredible that it lasted. That Elizabeth Carter, it's engraved with gold in black enamel all around the band, and she did, in fact, die in 1774. So that would have been recorded as the memento mori, the date. So many of these are engraved, inscribed. The next piece we have is this wonderful ring. And done in this great marquee shape. Let me turn it the right way. There it is. Okay. And it actually, in the middle, it does say souvenir, which means to remember. You have the gold work going around it, and then what you have here in the background, which is difficult to see, but it's very flat sheets of hair. And we're going to discuss that technique in detail. That is called palette work, where you actually take an emulsion and you paint it, clear emulsion, and you paint it on the shock of hair, and then you cut the pieces. So this is just a very, very beautiful, tasteful piece, probably from about 1780. I don't believe this one is engraved. Oops. We'll just set that down there. I think out of this collection that we have, the more interesting, or most interesting, is this piece. And it is such a plus because this piece has its original leather case. It is so unusual to find pieces of any jewelry with their original case, but particularly in this case, the hair work. This is an incredibly beautiful, detailed piece. Again, this would be about 1780 or 1790. And what you have here would be, let's take it out. What you have is a magnificent example of early macerated hair painting. So, you have the woman with her head down, and again, this would be painted on ivory. If they were to use paint, again, they would use a sepia pigment, the tiniest of brushes, like a miniatures painting. That's the type of brush they would use. Probably with maybe one or two bristles or one or two hairs in it to get this fine detail. But then as you go down from the sepia painting, you get into the macerated hair, which is a bit more, has more texture to it. And what I wanted to say about this piece, it has the enameling here, it has the small diamonds going around it, and it has the pearls. And we haven't talked about pearls. Seed pearls in mourning jewelry are very, very significant. They symbolize tears. So there you have it, all the tears of this person, this deceased person. Again, in the close-up shot, you will be able to see the inscription regarding the deceased when we zoom in on this. But you have an extra added feature in that it also has encased a lock of the deceased hair. So this was not uncommon. In fact, when we talk about locks of hair, the lock of hair had its own significance. It was not uncommon, it was customary for a loved one to give their betrothed, or the person they were in love with, a lock of their hair. This was a tradition that goes very, very far back. Again, you are giving something of yourself. This is something that grew from you. And the significance that you are giving this part of you to that person was the height of romantic sentimentality. But, as I said, they also did the locks of hair tied with little gold wire, and you would find them in the backs of memorial pieces. This pin was probably added later to make it into a brooch. Presumably it was worn as a neck piece with this veil on top. So what you have here are some nice early examples of the jewelry. And what would happen is, as I had alluded to before, you would, the person would pass away. And very simply, the funeral director would cut some of the hair. Then you would, maybe he would do this for you, since you were grieving. He would take that hair, send it to New York, Philadelphia, London, to one of these jewelers, and then you would pick out a design of what you wanted. Did you want a ring? Did you want a brooch? Whatever you wanted. And depending how much hair you gave them, obviously it didn't take much hair to do this little tiny ring. But as we go into the Victorian period, you'll see where there was a lot of hair used. So, big commercial industry. And predominantly, from what we've known, in the jewelers' back workrooms, it would be predominantly done by women who would sit at these big tables and just laboriously macerate the hair, paint with the hair maybe, weave it, do the palette work. But again, a very big industry. And we're going to talk about that too, about the industry of mourning, which really reached its zenith in the Victorian period, which is our next segment. So I hope that you've enjoyed the early pieces, and we will be moving on. The Victorians were obsessed with hair. So much so that there was this trend that we call the Rapunzel syndrome. The goal for women was to grow their hair as long as they could. And the true celebrities for that during that era in the late 19th century was the Sutherland sisters. They were from Niagara Falls. They were, as I said, 7 sisters. Their father was a pastor. And they each grew their hair to about 5 feet, 5 foot long. Well, he would do small carnivals and take them around. But then P.T. Barnum got in on the act, and they became part of his show. And what they would do is they would come out onto the stage with their backs to the audience. They would pull the pins out of their hair, and down the tresses would fall. They would also play musical instruments, each of the 7, and they did sell their very own hair grower tonic. But the other real big celebrity, let's call her, of the 19th century was Queen Victoria. You know, Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, where she remained until 1901 when she died. She married Albert, her beloved Albert, in 1840, and it was a wedding of bliss and 9 children later, and then Albert died, and she withdrew, and she actually became the queen of mourning, and she set the trend. She was in black for the remaining 40 years. The only time it's recorded that she wore something other than black was for her Diamond Jubilee. She was so bereft and so grieving so much that she had Albert's full morning toilet set up every morning for 40 years wherever she was in residence. Also, here on this side of the pond, of course, we had the Civil War. So we had 620,000 people die during that period. So as you can see, there was a lot of mourning going on. And what I want to talk about first here are the different techniques. As mentioned, these were all Victorian pieces, mostly ranging from the mid-19th century right up to 1900. Our first technique that we're showing would be the woven technique. It could be a basket weave, as you would see in these rings. Again, here is the ring, the mourning ring. It has a basket weave hair work behind it. It has black onyx jewels set around it, and it has the mother of pearl also. This ring, which is very plain, but it does say Dora. It's engraved, engraved Dora here. But this would be a rather typical example of what you would get post-funeral. So that if Dora was your mother, per se, the hair would be given to the jeweler, and then all the immediate members of the family would presumably have rings made with Dora's name and Dora's hair braided and going around in the channel of the gold ring. These are examples of brooches. There's also a love knot in here with the black onyx or the jet going around it. Another brooch shows definitely the basket weave of the hair with a Greek key going around that. Now, when we were talking about this jewelry, for the most part, a lot of this is English, some is French, but for the most part, this jewelry would be approximately 9 or 10 carat. There really wasn't that much of the 14 carat or the 18 carat as we know it today. Another very exquisite example, not English, but it is French. And this is the family bracelet of the de Latouche family. This was acquired in France by a dealer that I know and sold to me. And what you have here is you have this wonderful gold bracelet linked with all these individual pieces. Behind each of the very ornate initials, you will see woven hair, you will see braided hair of that individual. And as I said, what's really special about this is the bracelet does come with its original presentation box. This was made in Paris, and again, as we had mentioned before, many times the hair would be sent to the jeweler, and the jeweler would create these things. The next technique that we'd like to talk about is palette work. And this is something that actually could be done at home. Palette work and table work, which we'll be talking about eventually, these were at home, many times at home crafts, and I hate to use the word craft, because by the way, if you worked in hair, you were a hair artist. This was the art of hair work. But in ladies' periodicals such as Grundy's Ladies' Book and Castle's book also, you would have monthly instructions and illustrations of, let's say, how to do palette work. And palette work is just that. What this is you take the hair, and in all cases, by the way, the hair is washed. Then you take the clean hair and you get a palette. In those days, they would use marble or glass. You would then take your shock of hair and you would flatten it out as much as you could with virtually no overlap. You would then make a mixture of gum tragacanth, which is a natural gum. And it's used today, by the way, in candies and confections, so it's still out there. But you would make this very, very thin paste, gum tragacanth, that dries, it's transparent, and you would paint it on the shock of hair. You would then let that set up, and then you would take your very tiny surgeon scissors, were recommended, and you would cut out the various shapes to make your composition. And this is probably one of the grandest pieces that I have seen at this level. Again, this is not a memorial piece, but it's such a fine example of palette work that I wanted to show it to you. This is a whole grouping of pansies over here. I'm pretty sure it's American, it could be English. And anyway, what's wonderful is here's the original design by the artist and the numbers of whose hair. Unfortunately, the list of whose hair it is did not survive. So what's really great here is you have the dark brunette hair, you have the very light hair, probably from the grandparents, and then you have the red hair. And when you are collecting hair work, you are looking for that red hair because it doesn't show up as much as the dark hair. But anyway, this would be, they would be cut out, and pansies are for thoughts, so it's almost like thinking of me. They would be construed as thinking of me, because remember, in Victorian times, everything had a symbol, everything had a meaning. So every flower had a meaning. Forget-me-nots, thinking of me, roses for love. So all your pieces would be cut out. Then you would buy from a store that sold these supplies. You would buy your piece of milk glass, and you would then start gluing your pieces on and making your composition. But imagine every bit of what you see here is cut out palette work hair. Another example that we brought today is a very classic example of palette work. In most of the ladies' periodicals, they would feature illustrations of the Prince of Wales plumes. And this is the actual heraldic symbol of the Prince of Wales. What would be done here is you would lay your shock of hair out, and then you would start to get it into this C-type scroll. But before you did that, you would take a minute curling iron, tiny curling iron, and you would curl the ends. And you'd want those ends to set, and you will see the curled ends. This one is, there is gold wire here, and there are some seed pearls in it. It also has some gold, probably gold fill, decoration going around it. But the main thing we want to talk about is Whitby jet. This is carved Whitby jet. And Whitby jet, actually, it put a town on the map in England, Whitby, England, because it had the largest deposits of this petrified wood. They would mine this wood, they would dig up this wood, and then there were hundreds and hundreds of artisans that did all the carving. This jewelry was so popular for mourning. And we'll go back and we'll talk about mourning some more, the rituals of mourning. So, as I said, the Whitby jet, there were thousands and thousands of pieces made, earrings, brooches, bracelets, necklaces. It was a very popular thing, and it was what would be allowed to be worn. Again, I wanted to show this piece. This is probably one of the finest pieces, I think, of Whitby jet. It is a segmented bracelet that has now been elasticized. And you can see that it's carved, it's in beautiful shape, and it has this incredible belt motif that keeps showing up on Victorian jewelry. In fact, it more or less simulates a black belt with the tongue here, and the keeper on the tongue, and then you have the belt wrapping around it. But you can see the extent to which they would go with this Whitby jet and this carving. Our next technique that we want to talk about is table work. This was a technique that was done commercially, but also it was promoted as something to be done at home. And what it consisted of, it was so popular, particularly, I would say, after 1860. It was extremely popular. This is the type of table work that they do in Vamhus, Sweden, that I spoke about previously. And what it is a tripod table, either a floor model or a tabletop model. It's a tripod upon which there is a very smooth disc of wood. In the center is a hole, and the disc is attached to the three legs. Then there are markings all around the circumference of the disc. And what you do is, you take the hair, and you need long lengths of hair. Most of these bracelets these bracelets would require a 30-inch length of hair. The hair would be washed. You would then take the long hair and you would separate it, you would divide it into maybe 3 to 5 strands each. And you would tie the one end, you would take the other long end, and you would put a small lead weight that you would tie onto it. You did this for all the strands going around the circle, hole in the middle. Then you would tie all the strands together, and you would start with a rod, a metal rod, and it would weigh down the hair. It would start to pull the hair down through. And what you would do is you would cross over all the strands in different patterns. I cannot imagine how mind-numbing this must have been, this technique. Because in the books, particularly by Mark Campbell, there are hundreds of patterns for making braids, for weaving the hair, hundreds and hundreds. And again, Mark Campbell was a person who toured probably the eastern United States, and he taught this technique. And brooches were made, as you will see, necklaces, we're going to talk about them, all types of things with this table work. Now, I think what we'll start with would be probably this necklace. And what we have here is a necklace. I can only imagine how long some of these pieces of hair had to be. So if you can imagine that you have this tubular shape, this thin tubular shape going down through the hole, if you can imagine that, and it's being weighted by the metal rod, once you finish that whole length of it, and here comes the interesting part, you take it out, you cut it off, and you put it in the oven at a very, very low temperature, because the oven will tend to vitrify the hair molecules and make it much more resistant and resilient. So you would heat it. Then what the jeweler would do, let's say you could send this to the jeweler, he would then crimp it into these sections with gold beads, and in this case have a heart hanging here, and these don't quite match, but it's still the same technique. It's still all table work. And here are the earrings with these the eardrops. Another wonderful little example is the Faith, Hope, and Charity, and these are beautifully done, intricately done in gold, with the open work in the heart, and then the very tight, very, very tight table work that covers the metal of the cross and the anchor. But very, very traditional symbols for the Victorians. We have another bracelet here. This would be one of the suggested woven patterns here. This is more of a flat weave rather than a tubular weave. And of course, you could do this at home, send it, and then you could have the gold findings put on by the jeweler. I think the most exceptional bracelet we have is the snake bracelet. And the snake bracelet, it became very, very popular because Queen Victoria, being the trendsetter that she was, and very hip, she wore a snake bracelet. Well, then everyone had to have a snake bracelet. And this one is a great example with the gold findings. Here is the tubular table work woven. It symbolizes eternity, and the garnet symbolizes love. So you have love eternal. Now, we've just been talking mostly about women's jewelry. What we have here on this display is we have table work watch chains. Again, it could be hair from the deceased, or it could be hair from the wife, making this for her husband. But you have what's really wonderful with these two chains is you have the rare red hair down here, which is not as common to find in hair work. And then here you have a tricolor example, which is very rare to find the brunette, the light brunette, and then the gray hair. And what they would do is you could have any type of a fob put on it, but this was part of the gentleman's, routine in dressing, as to have his watch chain. The other little tiny thing that's here would be a stick pin for a gentleman. It does have a little bit of woven hair in it, and it has the belt wrapping around. This is engraved 1858. Just as an aside, I would like to say that I began collecting hair work about 35 years ago. I predominantly collected things that were in domes and in small shadow boxes, which we'll talk about in a bit. Some of the jewelry is mine, but most of the jewelry that you see here today was graciously loaned to us by Eden Daniels. And she is a Philadelphia jeweler, a collector, and a jewelry historian. So a big thanks to Eden Daniels for loaning some of these incredible pieces. Now, as we talk about this mourning and Queen Victoria, what with her being in mourning for 40 years, in other words, mourning in the Victorian period truly became an art form. It had extreme restrictions, rituals, and dictates. Women, for the most part, fell under that. Generally, the men could wear the watch chains, pins, a black armband, because they were considered that they were out, they were essential workers. It came down on the woman. And what we have here is a mock-up example, a more contemporary example of a mourning outfit. The idea was black, obviously. And the less shiny the black, the better. So absolutely, black crepe was the way to go. They wanted it flat, black. The other material that was very popular was bombazine. This is a very finely woven silk, and it could be used perhaps for a veil and whatnot. And when you were in full mourning, you basically, for at least a year, it could be upwards of 2 years or a year and a half, that you wore black every day. Your jewelry would consist of what you see here. It would be jet, it would be hair work, and maybe a tasteful cameo. And that was the extent of it. They really didn't want anything flashy, they didn't want diamonds, any reflective gems. If you could make it through full mourning, then you would go into what they called half mourning. And that's one of the reasons why we have this purple or lavender display. So it was acceptable then to go into half mourning. When someone died, there was a big ritual within the house. A black wreath would be put on the door, or black crepe would be hung over the door. Many times, The clocks would stop at the time of death, and very oftentimes they would cover the mirrors to negate reflection. The other thing too, what happened was not only the jewelry, but there was a whole enormous cottage industry of people selling mourning things. So if you had any questions about what was proper and what should be worn and what shall I buy, you would go to this mourning emporium and they would outfit you with anything and everything that you could possibly want. You would get your whole trousseau, you would get your calling cards, which would be edged in black. Your handkerchiefs also would be edged in black. Your stationery would be edged in black. And as I said, this, along with the jewelry, was just this incredible industry about mourning, the likes of which had not been seen, I don't think had been seen before, and certainly has not been seen since. In regards to the art of hair work, it wasn't all about jewelry. And there were also hair artists who did things a bit more three-dimensionally. That, over the years, has been my focus. Really, the domes, the shadow boxes with the hair art in them. And of course, there are many, many examples of memorial pieces, literally under glass. This is probably one of the finest examples that I have ever seen. And I was very fortunate to acquire this. A dealer that I know very well, she took many trips to France, and I had said to her, if you ever find the most perfect hair work dome, please buy it for me. Which she did. And she hand carried it back from France to here. Had some trouble at the airport, by the way, with the guards and the customs officials questioning the hair and whether it was a true French antique that should not leave the country. So I guess she had to do a lot of coercing. But they allowed her to take it, and it's here today. This is a memorial for the picture you see right in front. That is Sophie Henri. And you will notice on this carte de visite, there's our Sophie. It is edged in black. Again, everything you see a carte de visite edged in black, that's usually the deceased. Now we'll remove the dome so you can get a better look at what's going on here. So here it is. You have every kind of symbol possible. You have the weeping willow tree. You have Sophie's tomb. Everything that you see that is dark is Sophie's hair. You have this tree here, like an arborvitae or a poplar tree. Then you have curls, tight curls of Sophie's hair in various urns. On the front of it, tiny inscription that says, Souvenir de Sophie Henri, âge 21 or 21 years old. And she died in 1887. Now the story that goes with this, you can take it with a grain of salt, but when the dealer bought this in France, it was told, the family story is, when Sophie died, her hair was taken to a nunnery of Carmelite nuns. The nuns put this together, and then the family made a contribution or a donation to the nunnery. It seems believable. You will notice the cross. In many of these pieces, there are crosses, so there is the Christian iconography in there. Again, everything is Sophie's hair, and you have wonderful examples of the willow tree. This is all palette work. All of those hanging leaves are palette work. The cross is palette work. The curls have been probably trigacanth or Arabic wrapped around something and made into curls so that they set. The outline of the tomb is palette work, by the way, but all over this paper mache ground, you see hair, bits of hair, and that would be the macerated hair. The chopped hair would be there. As I said, I think it's one of the finest examples of memorial art under glass. Staying in the French mode, and in regards to memorials, again, it was about jewelry, it was about domes, but it was also about pieces that you would put on your wall. So that virtually every technique that was done in the jewelry or under domes would also be done in wall pieces. And here we have a quintessential example of French or Belgian hair art. This is the scene of the tomb of Madame Goethals. And Madame Goethals made it, luckily, to about age 40. And she died in 1878. And this piece just has wonderful detail. I doubt very much that this was created at home. This looks like a commercial piece, definitely. But you have all these techniques here that we've talked about, or several of them. Here you have the weeping willow tree again with the palette work. Palette work down here in the guard going around, the fence going around the tomb. And here is a professional litho that the people who would make this, and then they would print all the information of the deceased on it. The long bits of grass down here would be palette work, but the trees in the background, it's the macerated hair. So it's the chopped hair that has been put onto glued surfaces. Now originally, this background would have been white, but as you know, they were not using acid-free materials, so you see the general kind of beige or browning of it. This is the typical French wall memorial. They loved black ovals, just like this, with a domed glass over top. Now we're going to move on to another cemetery scene. And I would like to point out and suggest that this is American. I would bet that this was done at home. You can see it's not as sophisticated. It has the groundwork down here with the macerated hair. It has the fence with the palette work. The tomb is made of palette work. And a new technique is coming into place here. And that is GIMP work. And this exploded. This technique exploded after the mid-century, particularly here in the United States. It was done in Europe, but particularly here. And what this is you take the clean hair and you have your strands of hair, and if you can envision, you have a knitting needle or a very thin rod. You then run two wires, thin wire, which I'm going to show you, underneath it, and you loop the hair over the rod or knitting needle, and then you twist the wire. You loop, twist, loop, twist, loop, twist, loop, twist. So you have a running length or a GIMP of hair loops. And here you can see them forming the leaves, the foliage of the tree. The other thing to point out is if you don't have the date of birth or the date of death of the person, but obviously you have the symbols, the main thing is it's all one color hair. So It is the hair of the deceased. The wire I was talking about, I was lucky enough to find this on eBay. And this wonderful box, it's patented 1884, just about the time of the Grundy Museum. And in it is very fine hair wire on spools. Very thin, maybe 32 gauge or less. And it's advertised as hair wire, manufactured in Cleveland, Ohio. And you would think, well, maybe they call it hair wire because it's so thin. But this is tinned wire, and then it is shellacked. And I would think for common use you would not need a shellac wire, but it would be advantageous to have it if you were doing GIMP work. This technique of making the hair on the wire, that was predominantly done at home. That was an at-home parlor art. And if some of you are familiar with the larger shadow boxes, you will see enormous wreaths that were made out of hair and wire, flowers that were done. And many times these were family trees. Usually they were made by the youngest female in the family, and she would collect hair, her own, and then also from many family members to create these fabulous wreaths and arrangements that would be in larger shadow boxes. The last piece I have up on the mantle is another French piece. And it's something we wanted to talk about, and maybe it's a little bit more of a delicate subject, but this is the hair of an 18-month-old boy. His name was Alexander Rimbaud, and it says at the age 18 months. You could think it was his first haircut. I tend to believe that it is a memorial to Alexander, and it's very exquisitely done. It's mounted on milk glass, not ivory. And when we think about, let's say prior to 1900, even 1950, there were many infant deaths. For the most part, if your child lived to age 4 or 5, it was rather lucky. So babies, children died all the time, fevers, an assortment of things. And there were children memorials. I had one lady that I knew, she only collected children's memorials. And then again, it sounds rather macabre, but again, as I said before, death was a part of life. So the other thing that they would do, and the curator brought this, is it was not uncommon to take casket plates, engraved casket plates, such as this one. They would put it in the shadow box, and then maybe they would do a wreath or an arrangement around it. So this would be taken, obviously, before they were interred. A couple of final words on the art of hair work. When did it go out of fashion? What happened? It was so popular. And what we've come to believe is that really by World War I, it was over. When you stop and think about that period, the whole role of women, it was changing very dramatically. Women started to go into the professions. Women started to go into the workplace, even more so. They weren't exclusively homemakers. It was also the beginning of the modern era, the Jazz Age. And simply put, the hair being bobbed by Clara Bow, and also the Jazz Age, as I mentioned, in the modern era really brought about the demise of hair art and this ritualistic mourning practices. I mean, what we have left today is maybe people may take a piece of baby's first haircut and save that lock of hair, put it in the baby album. That's about the extent of it. A funeral, yes, it is considered to wear black. Not all people adhere to that. And other than that, we tend to more or less take our grief and our expression of grief, especially our outward public expression of grief, and we sweep it away. We put it away. That was not the case with the people of the 18th and 19th centuries. With all of these parlor arts in mind, and I've been collecting these, as I said, for 35 to 45 years, predominantly the domes and the shadow boxes, finally, some years ago, I thought there should be a book to commemorate this very fascinating part, particularly of the Victorian era. So I wrote the book, Under Glass, A Victorian Obsession. The idea here is that there are at least 11 to 12 chapters that deal with each medium that the Victorians used and put under glass. So it would be wax flowers, shell work, taxidermy, skeleton leaves, wool work. It's all in the book. Automatons was another thing that were under glass. Anything and everything. They love to put things under glass. And it really made a lot of sense because it protected the arrangements. It protected the objects, particularly the domes. So this is the beginning of the hair work chapter, chapter 3, hair today, hair tomorrow. And there is the lead picture, which we have in the video, of Hannah Sutherland behind her circa 1880s sofa. And how appropriate for the Grundy Museum being built in 1885. My book is available through the book website. I encourage you to buy the book through the website. If you want the truest, the best quality book with the best color reproductions, is to get it through the website. And that website is Under Glass, a Victorian Obsession.com.